6PI, your source for the esoteric, irrelevant, and Santa Claus mistletoe madness that affects our everyday lives. I'm your host, Mitch Miller. And boy, oh boy, wowie zowie, guys. I hope you had an awesome, wonderful Christmas this past week. I know for me, it was a very memorable one. Got to hang out with a lot of friends, got to have some delicious food. And I must say, it's probably one of the best Christmases that I've had in a long, long time. I hope yours was the same way. Christmas time is something I've never been really excited about. This is kind of like a really sad part of, the year for me. I'm not a huge Christmas guy. I don't know. Maybe it's like, how everybody's kind of fake nice to each other for a couple weeks and then, everything kind of goes back to being what it is. That's just my view on it. But this one, I have to say, this time around was really good. I truly enjoyed it. If you haven't yet, submit your Q&A questions. Coming sometime next year. I'm not going to tell you when, because personally, I don't know when. It's probably going to be sometime before February. I'm almost 100% sure. Either way, if you haven't yet, send in your questions. Send them into 6BI Podcast on Facebook, or you can send them into podcast6bi@gmail.com. I do check both mediums very regularly. So if you do have any questions, send them in, or if you can meet me in person, ask me in person, I'll write it down and make sure that your question gets answered on the air. So today for the podcast, I thought I'd do something a little bit different. Something that I'm not sure that I've done maybe since about the first episode. Maybe on the first episode, you remember me talking about different podcasts that had inspired me to put out this podcast. It's been a long time, folks. If you stuck with me this long, it's been a good long while since I've talked about podcasts that have influenced me and have had influence on this podcast that you've listened to. But I thought I'd do something a little bit different today. I thought I'd give you guys my podcast recommendations for 2019. I picked 3 podcasts that I listen to on the regular, and whether they've had a great impact on this podcast or not, I really think you guys should go out and listen to these other podcasts. And continue to listen to this one, of course. Why not? These 3 I've picked out of the many, many I've listened to because whenever I'm in conversation with somebody, they usually come up. They are usually podcasts I talk about. There's something that you can bring up to a variety of people. There's a little bit of something for everybody in these shows. You may or may not have heard of them already, and you're probably bound to find 1 or 2 that you've never heard of before. So, without further ado, let's get to it. The first podcast I'd like to recommend is a podcast called Ear Hustle. Ear Hustle takes place inside of San Quentin State Penitentiary in California. It is a prison podcast run by the inmates, produced by the inmates, directed by the inmates. Almost every job done on Ear Hustle is done by somebody who is incarcerated, which is a really cool take on the podcast. You get to hear different stories from different people of how they got locked up, what do they do for fun in prison, what kind of food do they eat, what is it like, working the line at prison on an assembly line for a job. What is it like dealing with health issues in prison? Talking about people dying in prison. There's many different topics this show goes into. A lot of them are user-generated submissions that they've pulled out over the years. I believe the first season they kind of did their own thing, but more and more I'm starting to see them listening to their audience on what exactly they like to hear. They go into topics such as finding love in prison versus finding love with somebody on the outside. How can you be in a relationship in prison with somebody from outside? What are you able to do? How are you able to meet up with them? They also talk to death row inmates. What's it like living on death row, waiting for a judge to hear your case, to potentially get yourself out of a horrible, horrible situation. The show was originally hosted by Nigel Poor, who is a journalist and has done a couple different works dealing with prisoners inside the penitentiaries. The other one was an incarcerated man named Earlonne Woods. And I say was incarcerated because as of, I believe, last year, he was released from prison. The governor granted him a stay on his sentence. He was able to get out early. And now Earlonne does stuff on the outside. and interviews of people trying to rehabilitate from prison, get back into work life, get back into social life outside of prison. The new host that they have on with Nigel Port is a man serving, I think, 25 to life for murder. But this show helps give you an insight into the people that are living in prison. And we don't always get painted the best picture of people in prison. The first thing I think about when I hear the word prisoner is shows like Beyond Scared Straight, or different episodes of Cops where they might be dealing with suspects that have come in and out of prison over the course of their life. The people on this show, for the most part, they sound very intelligent. They sound very well book read. These people have done bad things in their life, but they've also learned how to reform their ways, make improvements on themselves, and better themselves as human beings. In whole, I think this is an awesome program. I've been listening to it since their very first episode about 2 years ago now. And it's one that just goes by way too fast. A 40-minute episode just seems to fly by no matter what time or when I listen to it. So that would have to be my first podcast recommendation for you. With that being said, that is definitely my first recommendation. Check them out. The episodes have different topics that you really do not get to hear about from Prisoners on the Inside. It's a great podcast. My second recommendation for all those out in Radio Land for you guys to listen to would be the podcast called Ron Fuller Studcast. On his podcast, Ron Fuller talks about his many championship victories and belts held across the entire world, his running of one of the greatest and often forgotten about wrestling territories in the Southeast, and also his many funny stories and exploits with fellow professional wrestlers. Now, I know what you're saying. Well, Mitch, I'm really not into professional wrestling. Well, Ron Fuller can deliver a story like none other. Ron Fuller, it sounds like I'm doing a paid plug for this guy's podcast, but no, seriously, this guy is an amazing storyteller whose stories go beyond the actual realm of the ring, where he talks about politics backstage, having to manage a territory on his own at a ripe 25, 26 years old, having to build up his reputation and credibility in a town that, well, it's my hometown of Knoxville, Tennessee. He had to build up his reputation and status in a town that was very familiar with one way of wrestling, and he had to come in and reinvent the wheel. He has many stories just dealing with the different personalities he deals with, and it's not always on wrestling. He talks about his time in the Bahamas, in Australia, sharing sociable times with wrestlers outside the ring. He is a great person to listen to. It's fascinating for me in the wrestling sense because I get to hear the history of wrestling in my hometown. If you live there currently nowadays, you wouldn't hear so much as an inkling of any sort of modern wrestling happening in Knoxville nowadays. But so many years ago, Knoxville was a wrestling hotbed. People did want to go work in Knoxville and wrestle. Wrestling was a major attraction in Knoxville. So just to have him relive his glory days, running and managing a territory, wrestling as a singles wrestler and a tag team wrestler. But you know how, let's say you're watching TV and you see a celebrity and he says, oh yeah, I've passed through Knoxville a time or two, or I passed through Nashville a time or two, and it's a lovely city. I get that same sort of guy who used to live in and around Knoxville say all this about this great city. He talks a lot about Chilhowee Park, for those of you that know Chilhowee Park. He talks a lot about the Knoxville Civic Coliseum. He talks about just the general history of the buildings, of the land, on who he had to deal with at WBIR, who he had to deal with at, different local radio stations. It's interesting stuff. If you like small town history, this is the podcast for you. Give it a look. Give it a listen. It's Ron Fuller Studcast. And my final recommendation is the first podcast I had ever listened to that got me interested in just listening to all different types and styles of podcast. This one's called Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal Podcast. You guys might know Gilbert Gottfried as the parrot in Aladdin, or he's been on the Fairly Odd Parents a time or two. He's got a really scratchy, high-pitched voice, a very scratchy and high-pitched bellowing laugh. It's like, if a seagull were to laugh and have something stuck in its throat. It's a pretty insane laugh. Like I said before, this was the first podcast I had ever listened to. This is the one that got me into listening to all these different types and styles of podcasts. Each week, Gilbert Gottfried and Frank Sandal-Padre sit down with a different celebrity from a different decade and talk about their life in Hollywood, their career in movies and television, personal stories and stories that they have about meeting different movie stars, working with different stars on the set. It is a great piece of Americana. It is something that probably deserves to be in the Library of Congress for all the work that they do into preserving the history of old Hollywood and old actors. I'll be perfectly honest with you, a lot of their guests are above the age of 70. These guests are, in their twilight period of their career, and they sit down with these guests and review the high points and low points over the years. But many of these guests really were big in the 60s and 70s, some even in the 50s and the 40s. To get a guest on that old that can tell you what's happened in the world in the past 70, 80 years, I think is freaking phenomenal. It is something that I, as a listener, I don't know for you, but for me, I love listening to about just how things worked several years ago, before I was born. Even if you were to go back to 1981, 10 years before I was born, things were a whole lot different. The world acted a different way. And to hear many of these people just talk about how Hollywood has transformed over the years and has turned into what it is now, it's both heartbreaking and very insightful to hear all these old actors and actresses talk about these different things. Some people I would definitely recommend you go listen to on the podcast that they've had on: Howie Mandel, Penn and Teller, Artie Lang, Sonny Fox. Those are just some people that have stuck with me over the years when I've been listening to the podcast, whether it's been for funniness, profoundness, insight, anything like that. Start out with those episodes. If you listen to those episodes, I am sure you're going to be hooked. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up this episode. Go check out these podcast recommendations. I'm sure you will not be dissatisfied. Just to go over them again, the first one I had mentioned was called Ear Hustle. The second one is Ron Fuller's Studcast. The third one is Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal Podcast. Anyway, folks, this is the last podcast of the year. Everybody, thank you for your continuous support on my podcast. Like I said before at the top of the program, go like us on 6BI Podcast on Facebook. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, send it to podcast6bi@gmail.com. Until next year, folks, stay well, stay safe, don't drink too much, and most importantly, stay tuned.